the provision on, let's just get straight into it. The
Yeah.
provision on blasphemy, for example, 295A, speaks of outraging religious feelings and the insult to religion. Right. Now, of course, when this provision was challenged in Ramji Lal Modi in the Supreme Court read it down and it said it's not just any old insult. It's not even a deliberate or malicious insult that is criminalized. It's got to be an insult that leads to or has the tendency to lead to a public order disruption, the disruption of public order. Okay. Now, public order is not one guy assaulting another. Public order is something much larger. The public order is much more like a riot, or that sort of thing. I understand, not I don't understand. This law should have been struck down. However, there have been a large number of cases where people have been arrested and put through the ringer of a criminal trial because of this law, because a constable doesn't know about Ramji Lal Modi. A constable doesn't know about the reading down of this law, right? Um, Indeed, many, and so on registration of FIR, that is the stage at which such law should be not applied because the ingredients are not made out. If there isn't a sort of proximate link between the speech and the disruption of public order, correct? Um, and you're only obliged to register the FIR under the constitutional judgment of Lalita Kumari if it discloses a cognizable offense. And if it doesn't disclose a cognizable offense, if it's not made out because there isn't that proximate link to public order, then you shouldn't register the FIR. The point here is not much more interesting and much more, it's a much bigger problem. The point here is that the police itself was admitting that there was no such material. So, what does this mean? Muslims have, in any case, Muslims and STs and SCs have, in any case, been overrepresented in our criminal justice system. And of course, the question that would be asked by many of those in the right wing, perhaps some of you are here, is that, and it's a valid question, statistically speaking, is that do they commit crimes at a higher rate? No. Because the conviction rate, right, then demonstrate that this is not the case. Today, then, I think we've got to ask ourselves, is it that discrimination in the criminal justice system has crept into the criminal justice system in a bigger way? Is this comedian, is this speaker being put through the ringer of the criminal justice system for the crime of making jokes while being Muslim? I was sent this video of this young man saying something about how Madhuri Dixit, Ek Do Teen, how it stops at 14, and then linking it to uh, uh, Sita Ji ka Ram ka Banwas and the 14 years, right? Now, it wasn't offensive. I mean, it was just the fact that he spoke about Madhuri Dixit and Sita Mata in the same breath, you know? Why then do I speak of, and I think this is, it's not a canary in the coal mine because I think we're way, way, way beyond that. I think it is the blatant nature of the fact that the somebody who's linked to the ruling party, whether through family or whether through other means, could essentially come in and assault and falsely imprison a citizen of this country without any reason, and to have the courts take over that mob initiative and perpetuate it either that essentially by inaction, and it could be just because it could be, look, the high courts are overburdened and sometimes things just get adjourned. But that is a huge rule of law problem, and it goes to the heart of our polity, right? Because today it's Munawar Faruqi, tomorrow it could be you or me. it's very important to remember that it's not just that first they came for the Jews and I did not speak up, right? Um, a number of Hindu comedians have also been targeted. Bizarrely, comedians seem to be some of the greatest. Instead of a photo bombing, there was a kind of photo dropping out on the right just now. Um, Comedians seem to be at the vanguard of political speech these days. And it's a very important vanguard because a lot of our news outlets seem to be taken over in the marketplace of ideas by monopolistic entities and cross ownership that have relationships with the ruling party, some of which are clear, some of which we can't possibly know because we don't know who's giving money to the ruling party through electoral bonds, keeping in mind that this is one of the most important cases that has not been taken up by the Supreme Court. The and I'd like to keep a significant amount of time for questions because I would much rather continue the conversation. The reason I spoke about freedom and flourishing is because we have seen in the United States how quickly things can turn on a dime. But it doesn't happen without hope. And it doesn't happen without a true belief in the founding principles of this nation. And it doesn't happen without the hard work and the organizing that takes. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. There are high courts across the country that are upholding these rights. There are people who are resisting the clampdown on speech through their technological platforms. There are many rights to be obtained that aren't at the edge, that are being either ignored or are not as hugely and violently contested. And all of these are extremely significant. At the IITs, you are working, many of you. I realize not all because I spoke to a class. I gave a talk to Arudra Burra's class on freedom of speech, and I realized that some of you work on things other than technology, um, but many of you do work on technology, right? And I think that these issues are particularly important and at the cutting edge of where at the cutting edge of some of our rights in this polity. Now, there is a delegation. So I'm going to talk about just a couple of ideas. There's a delegation of regulation to some extent to technology, either by design or by default. That delegation is by design in the case of blockchain technology. Um, and I'm going to give you two examples of how. The RBI notification finding the Bitcoin structure to be, illegal was set aside by the Supreme Court in quite a robust judgment. Currently, I am in the High Court to uphold the validity of the TCCPR, which is basically a regulation, a telecom regulation that, so I'm there for Paytm. It's a telecom regulation that seeks to ensure the integrity, the veracity of data um, through a distributed ledger technology between telcos, principal entities, which is the companies that seek to send mass messages to their users, through telecom spectrum and triangulating the consent of the users through their interactions between the telcos and the principal entities that sometimes they are already clients of, right? Now, earlier, the regulatory body used to be TRAI, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, right? TRAI is very small. It was very difficult for TRAI. So, and they'd also rely on sort of agent companies, essentially, you know? And it wasn't a structure that worked particularly well. This structure seems a lot more robust. And on paper, it seems like a great structure in order to limit spam and also to limit, this is our case, fraud that is perpetuated through unsolicited commercial communication, right? Now what's happening is that the structure is meant to work because of the distributed ledger technology by itself. And that only at the second instance does TRAI come in as a regulatory authority. And at the third instance, in a very significantly tertiary hands-off sort of manner, does the court come in, right? The thing is that technology is only as good as the hands that it is in, right? And if it's only the regulation that is requiring you to do something, and actually all this like large amounts of spam is increasing the traffic on your platform, and it just makes sense for you to just carry on as usual until somebody tells you to, right? You're not really going to bother that much. Which is where I think the role of the regulatory authority, whether it's the governmental regulatory authority or whether it's the court, even though it's smaller, becomes much more significant. And that is what we are telling the court, right? That where we are demonstrating that there are penalties that, to be had, that, kindly make that happen. And we have succeeded to a degree because TRAI has imposed penalties of about, tens of crores against some of the telco, not imposed, show cause notices have been issued. Let's see how it goes. As you know, telcos are some of the most powerful players in this ecosystem. So it's a huge battle. Let's see how it goes. There's another kind of delegation that is being talked about quite a lot. And that delegation is to speech intermediaries, right? The most recent example of an egregious act by such a speech intermediary was the WhatsApp, Facebook sharing of data that is attempted to be foisted upon us, but not on the Europeans because they have the GDPR. Right? Now, in such a case, what does this mean for us in terms of? I'm going to speak about, to an extent, about regulation, but then I'm also going to come to you, and that's the kind of conversation that I'd like to have about you as technologists, right? I'd like for us to collectively think a bit about that. Now, what that means in terms of regulation is that there's a crying need now for that data protection law to come in. The data protection law currently exists in a draft form. It's deeply problematic in a number of ways, though it also borrows from the GDPR, because there is a over delegation of powers, for example, in Section 35, where they just the constitutional categories are set out and they over delegate the ability to make regulations in ways that are not proportionate or necessary, right? Which is sort of boiling down what the Constitution requires and was in the draft law created by Justice Sri Krishna, but here it's basically bumped off. Allowing too much sway to private players and also allowing too much sway to sort of people in without the law specifying what is required, right? It's called an over delegation of power. There's a crisis today of hatred, of truth, and following that of democracy. We see this crisis being played out in country after country. There's a reason that our polities are divided as, I think, as never before, because there are very contradictory versions of what is absolutely true. It's not that all of these versions, it's not like it's like Rashomon, the Japanese film where there were these different versions of what the truth was, or it's not that each person has a side of the elephant, right? There are some versions of the truth that are blatantly false and are verifiably false. At the margin, fake news is difficult to determine because it could be your view versus mine, but that we should remember is only at the margin. There's a large center in terms of fake news where there are things that are complete lies that are being circulated as true. I think there is a role for technology to, I think the intermediaries, of course, have a responsibility, but there is definitely a problem that we must empathize with in that role of intermediaries, because where speech is crowdsourced and regulation is not, can you have a bunch of people sitting just in Dublin in Ireland, or even in each country, a few people in each country, make sure that the terms of service of the particular intermediary are enforced? The terms of service, by the way, are really sound really great. I mean, if you look at WhatsApp, not WhatsApp, WhatsApp doesn't regulate speech. WhatsApp says that it can't listen to conversations. I have concerns about that, not just the metadata. But if you look at Facebook's terms of service, if you look at Twitter's terms of service, there's nothing wrong with them. You know, if you even look at Google's terms of service, right? It's in their enforcement that it becomes a problem. Um, there was underinvestment on the part of Twitter for a long time. Twitter then realized when they were trying to sell the company that there would be a business impact, and Twitter's hate speech problem affected its price, which is when they tried to get their act together. They still haven't got their act together. In their limited defense, it's difficult, as I said, that when your speech is crowdsourced to regulate in this way, because if you're going to even follow a notice and take down structure, which is not what this jurisdiction requires, and I contributed to that. I was one of the people who argued the Shreya Singhal case, in which the court said that it is only after a court order that you need to take something down, or if the government says that something needs to be taken down, right? That's when you have to take it down. You can comply with your own terms of service and take down something otherwise, but that's when you have to take it down. But that is, I think, too hands off now. One of the ideas I had, and we've already established that Wikipedia can be a bit dodgy, right? But I think there's some things Wikipedia does better than these companies. What's the editing structure? That you have people contribute, but you also have a sort of certification process that as you get better and better at it, you get recognized as a better and better editor. So I wonder whether we can have such a structure in the enforcement of terms of service, or the application of terms of service rather. So since speech is crowdsourced, also crowdsourced regulation. Now, of course, that might mean that your entire IT cell comes and takes all of my TL down. But if the certifying structure is robust enough that they don't get recognized as editors and they get bumped off because they recognize, they seek to take down things that are otherwise, verifiable and true and within the ambit of free speech, then there's something that could work. I've been trying to hawk this. I think is fairly simple. I've been trying to hawk this idea for a while. Maybe one of you will take it up. There are huge exclusions that happen when we develop technology. All of our institutions, all of the institutions that the person who so kindly introduced me mentioned that I went to, also true of IITs, true of all our elite institutions, they tend to be dominated by Savarna, Hindu, able bodied, straight men, right? Um, I am learning continually. I'm trying to speed up my learning in this about caste and the privilege that I carry. I think it's incumbent on, and the other kinds of privilege also that I carry, while being also aware of the disadvantages of the lack of privilege, the lack of gender privilege, for example, right? So I think that's an area that we have to work quite a lot on, and also the area of participation, because tinkering with AI, for example, ex post facto, almost like doesn't work. So because once you've built the initial structure, the data that's fed in, right, if it's already biased, then you've got a system that actually perpetuates itself. So at the bottom floor, I think what we've got to do is make sure that there's diversity amongst developers. We've got to make sure that we ourselves, but it's also important to be clear that just because you have, for example, women on the Supreme Court, although that's a goal in and of itself, doesn't mean that you're going to get feminist judgments, right? So therefore, I think all of us together have a duty to start thinking about these issues in terms of, as Gandhi said, the face of the most disadvantaged person that I know across the spectrum. Um, I think there are also ways in which tech achieves economic and social rights and also civil and political rights in effective and fast ways. One of these things that I have been very keen on is the technology that allows through voice searches, voice to enabled searches, and for those searches to then talk back at you so that illiterate people have access to a much greater ambit of what literate people have access of the knowledge and the markets and um, communication that literate people have access to, and that was being pioneered in Kenya, Rwanda back in the day, but now I think that's gotten to a much more advanced state. So I think just in terms of access, then that's something very significant. We just spoke about AI opportunities for technology to self-regulate in the same way that blockchain does. Um, Larger, greater participation, but also, training ourselves, listening very carefully to people who are less advantaged than us. And there will always be people less advantaged than us, whoever we are, right? Here in this scenario, I mean. Um, that's where I think freedom and flourishing through technology can come. I also believe that it's very central for us to nurture hope within ourselves and be the hope, embody hope, and support it through each other. One of the jobs of hegemonies is to kill that hope, because that is what perpetuates power. All evidence shows that as a community, whether it's global or whether it's Indian, we have progressed if you look at the last 100 years. We have progressed in terms of fewer children if you look at the long arc of the moral universe. We have progressed in terms of fewer children dying of malnutrition, fewer children wasting away, greater access to speech, um, advances in women's rights. If you look at the last 30 years, the picture's less bleak. The picture's a bit more bleak, right? Um, but it's by dreaming the dream. It's by connecting on visions of what is possible and then making the possible happen and making what's previously seemed impossible happen, that we advance the cause of constitutional rights, technology, and our nation. Let's throw this open to questions.
Thank you, Karuna. Thank you for that. I wanted to actually touch upon a few subjects that you just mentioned. First, I think you started off with free speech and what happened to Munawar. And
Mm,
also, then you went on to talk about the role of technology in the legal space, per se, like regulation. But my question is related to both, sort of.
sure.
So, we sort of live in an attention economy where everybody's fighting for our attention on social media everywhere, and we all know that social media runs on outrage, so everybody's job seems to be to get triggered while going there. So there is this um, whenever I go through my timeline, there are so many instances when I keep getting triggered, and you want to comment and you want to react, and there are people reacting to your things also. And you have been facing that a lot, right? I mean, like through the years, I have seen your social media presence as well. How do you deal with that? And I'll come to my following question after that.
The trolling.
Not just the trolling, but just being a part of this attention economy, or being a part
That's
of this
interesting.
whole sort of outrage system.
See, okay, that's interesting because I get asked about the trolling a lot. The trolling, look, I just blocked the trolls. I blocked most of the IT cell and I did it quite early. And the
Yeah,
reason I did it quite early is because I realized that they don't have the a right, any claim over my attention,
yeah,
And it's because I work in the free speech space that I know that because I'm not the president, like Trump should not be able to block people, right? Or
yeah,
should not have been able to block people while he was president from his POTUS account. Um, Arguably also from his regular account when he was president. That I am not the president, I am not a minister, I am not even an MP, right? So I can block whoever I want. So I just block them all. And I think that was hugely useful. Otherwise, I went through phases where, and I even still go through phases where I make jokes, I mock, and I think that's very effective. It's also
yeah,
entertaining.
yeah. It is.
Um, and I think counter speech actually is useful and important because what counter speech does is puts the idea in its place, you know? And I think it sets you apart from victimhood.
Yeah,
I think that's also important, you know?
yeah.
Not just for yourself, but also symbolically. In terms of the attention economy, now that's an interesting question. See, I use Twitter for all sorts of things. I actually just really like it. I'm very comfortable with it in many different ways, right? Like I
Hmm.
have fun with it. I sometimes have silly conversations. Um, like sometimes I'll say something just because it's controversial, because the reactions are amusing.
See, that's precisely what I was coming to, right? So,
Like the
like,
Beatles. Like, so for
yeah.
example, recently somebody was saying, somebody at the New Yorker was saying that which is the most overrated band. Okay. Now, this is something I've thought for a long time. And I think people don't say it enough. And I think the Beatles' early work was very pleasant, but really musically not very sophisticated. Honestly, I didn't think it would get such a reaction. but it was an amusing conversation. So yeah, but in other terms, I use it in two different ways, which is one, that if something's trending, to use that opportunity to talk about something that I think is important,
Mm.
and on the flip side, to create conversations about issues that I feel are important,
Fair,
right?
right?
On both sides. But also, I've had, like, I've had both sides. I've now been sort of mildly well known for a while. So I get both sides of it. I get sometimes a sort of lionizing and a huge congratulation, um, which is very kind, and like it, really sort of raises spirits and feeds into the work I do and kind of keeps me motivated. But at the same time, I know that there is a tendency to put people on pedestals, and I am blatantly human and extremely imperfect, you know?
Makes sense.
So I think it's very important to keep that distance. But also now, it's that whenever somebody, like if somebody has a problem and wants to, then you can ride off that reputation
Hmm.
and you can ride off that lionizing, because then you're going to get hurt because if you've said something,
Right.
right?
But more in
That
the
even
sense of,
sounds like it has, yeah.
yeah, more in the sense of my follow-up question was actually about that
Okay,
I mean, as an individual, I understand where you're coming from, right? You're
right.
using it in different ways. Obviously you're doing it to your benefit. uh, what happens when
I mean,
something
not
like
necessarily
a,
to my personal benefit. Most frequently, it's towards this benefit of some ideas or,
sure, sure,
yeah,
sure, for the larger benefit, for the greater good, or however you want to define it. But
mm,
my question would be also about when something like an institution gets involved in the same thing, right? Like for instance, Kunal Kamra,
mm,
a contempt of court case was against him, and as far as I read, it was filed by a law student, right?
ridiculous. Yeah,
And the AG approved it, and now it's going to court. Same thing sort of happened with Prashant Bhushan and other places. Now, contempt of court is a very weird concept to begin with. I mean, why should there be a contempt of court law in the first place? The
correct.
court can be criticized as you want, like any other institution. But I'm just wondering how this whole controversy sort of fed into the attention economy as well. So, in a way, the court was also indulging in this. So, I just want to hear your thoughts about this, because the next institution that we can also look at is the government, right? Which is constantly looking at taking your attention through various things, right? But what happens when the court also tries that? Or do you think it is trying to do that?
Look, I think that the way contempt of court works, and I think that contempt of court should not exist unless there is a sort of administration with the interference with the course of administration of justice, right? But I think the way that it works is that if there is something that is being said that has enough of an audience, then that is the achievement of that attention is what the court then reacts to. It's not a competition for attention, you
Hmm.
know? Well, I mean, you could see it in a different way. You could see it as the reaction of the court attempting to quell that attention through bringing attention to the act of contempt, right? Otherwise, the quelling doesn't happen if people don't talk about the contempt. That is true. But that is secondary. I think the act itself is an act of power as opposed to an act of attention claiming. I think that
Right.
is where the problem lies. Um, I think that is where a problem lies. Yeah.
Fair, but okay, I'm just going to move on to the audience questions also. I think there is one question that has come in
Yeah, I'd
from
love to hear from you.
Bhaskar. And Eric's, you can ask your question as well. I'll put it forward to her. Before this, Ronak has sent me a few questions that came before this session. So I'm just going to ask a few from there first.
And the
Um,
ones that came before, could we have the person who asked the question?
I
Maybe we
wasn't
could
given
call
any
on them if they're here.
names. Yeah, we can call on them. I wasn't given any
Okay.
names when I was given
Let's
these
speak
questions.
up when Meghnath reads it.
Yeah. So, The first question was about what are the prime reasons judiciary is not able to maintain distance, independence from the government. What can be made out of the frequent cases in Supreme Court for contempt of court, which is what I was going to go towards as well.
I think the contempt is separate from the lack of rigorous implementation of the separation of powers and jurisdiction by the judiciary, because the contempt happens because the judiciary itself is being insulted, right? And so it's more between the citizen and the judiciary. I think the judiciary feels very helpless in the face of social media and the speed of social media and the seeming, not the seeming, the unruly nature of social media, right? And the fact that they can't speak. I think they find that very difficult. Um, I also think that while I believe that contempt jurisdiction in this manner shouldn't exist, at the same time, there is another side to it, that in the absence of controls on fake news and in the with the speed of these sorts of issues, I think there is real damage being done to trust across the board. And I think this includes the judiciary, rightly or wrongly. I think this includes the judiciary, right? So I can understand that this is a problem at a deeper level that they are concerned with. Is contempt the way to grapple with it? It's what is currently available to them. I think what should be actually grappled with, and it's a lot less easy, is the root problem. It's the problem of fake news. It's the crisis of confidence. It's in our institutions. It's the crisis of democracy.
And about the independence of judiciary as well.
In terms of the independence of the judiciary, we see just so many judgments, one after the other, where the electoral bonds issue is being bumped off, is not being heard, where the
Yeah.
internet in Kashmir, if you read that judgment, Anuradha's judgment, what it says is that, look, what happened was wrong, and future courts should make sure that it's wrong. But the current issue of restoring internet to Kashmir, we're going to give to a committee in government, basically bouncing it back to government, right? Sort of saying that what you did was anti-constitutional or unconstitutional rather, but now you decide what is to be done. Future courts, if this is ever done in the future, you must not allow this to happen. No. No, how
That's
do
the
you say
same thing
that?
they said about ordinances also.
They see it the same. There's a large number of judgments like this,
Yeah.
right? Which have led to sort of see some serious disappointment. Now, why? I think the why is a much tougher issue. You had, and I'm just going to tell you what the facts are, and then I'll lead you to draw whatever conclusions you like. There were 4 judges that spoke up about the fact that allocation of cases was not being done in a predictable way um, at the time. And these judges included a judge who then later became the Chief
Chief
Justice of the
Justice.
Supreme Court, right? Now, when this gentleman became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, things changed and they changed dramatically. So we have to ask ourselves why. Not only did the master of the roster privileges continue and cases continued to be allocated in ways that were unpredictable, subsequent to the tenure, and this tenure also saw judgments that were very much unpredictably in the government's favor, in the current government's favor. We also saw this gentleman receiving, blatantly becoming a part of the ruling party, right? Essentially, well, not a part of the ruling party, but receiving major benefits from the ruling party. So, in such a situation, we can only guess at what's happening behind the scenes. And I think that is something that we must be deeply concerned about.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to take the next question, which is from Bhaskar in chat. He says,
Hello, Bhaskar. You're on Twitter a lot.
can
Yeah.
anonymized or pseudonymized data be outside the purview of personal data? As then it gives companies to use the data and target an individual based on metadata. Should the law recommend either anonymization or pseudonymization, for instance, as the EU GDPR does to protect the identity of an individual? The data protection law has such sections, right?
But I also think that it's not dispositive in the data protection law. I mean, I think that there's some leeway given in the data protection law, which is not okay. So the answer to your question, Bhaskar, is yes. You know, that at the very least, at the very lowest threshold, that there should be anonymization or pseudonymization. But at the same time, we have to make sure that there isn't the ability to also de-anonymize.
Hmm.
You know, um, which I don't think exists in our current law. Um,
Or even the draft law.
I mean, the draft law, there is no
Yeah.
current law. I mean, otherwise, you've got Puttaswamy, which is very broad. Um, yeah.
But can you
But I
also,
also just think that in terms of larger, that kind of large tranches of data, even if it's anonymized, um, I think there are things that you can tell about populations and how to manipulate populations that also make me uncomfortable, right? That can be used, for example, for electoral gains, whereas you've gathered it, and then, the Cambridge Analytica example, right? Um, Whereas you've gathered it for through some stupid game, you know, like which animal do I feel like today? Um, So I think the nature of consent and the boundaries of the purpose for which you can use the data, also need to be looked at. The regulation of which is a lot harder because once somebody has the data, how do you determine what they do with it? But what you can determine is who they sell it to. I think that's very possible. And also, I think one very important move that's happening in this space is a call to, and that's something News Laundry is doing, is getting subscribers to pay for the service so that it's not the advertiser that is the client, so that it's the user that is the client, right? The problem with this, of course, is that then you lose out. I mean, then you're not bringing it to people who need it for free. And um, our driver who can't read or write just friended my father on Facebook, which I just thought was a great moment. I'm pretty sure that he wouldn't find it useful enough, that he wouldn't pay for it normally, but that once he uses it, that there will be sort of things that he finds it very useful for. Um, so I don't think the subscription model is an absolute answer at all. But I think cutting that cord between advertisers and that sort of thick relationship between advertisers and intermediaries, with the user being the product, is something that has to be broken.
so about the subscription model, so the way News Laundry works is that
I'm a
we
big
don't
fan. I
put,
have to subscribe.
yeah.
I donate to people, but then I don't. I must subscribe to yours. Yeah.
Right. So the way News Laundry works is that we don't put everything behind a paywall.
Yeah.
We put certain exclusive content behind the paywall, like interviews, etc. But everything
Right.
else is freely available. So essentially, the idea is that people who can pay will also pay for the people who will get it for
Yeah.
free.
Yeah.
So, for instance, we have a student subscription model also, where
Yeah.
if a student can't afford to pay for subscription, they can just write to us and we give it to them, because
Hmm.
there are other people who are funding their subscriptions.
Yeah.
So we are also like tinkering with the obviously the model a lot on a day to day or a regular basis. So it's still in experimental mode, but I think
Okay.
worldwide we are seeing that everywhere media is going for subscription, because ad rates are dropping, they are not getting much money from YouTube, everywhere revenues are dropping except for subscriptions. So that is one thing. And funnily enough, even in the TRP scam, one thing that came out was that channels were getting a lot of money by when people subscribe to DTH packages, right? So even they are trying to go for that model. So in a
Right.
very weird hybrid way. But I'll take the next question now. Um, there are a bunch of them, but I'll take a quick one. So Divya asks, do you feel that our anti-rape laws should be more strong?
Is Divya here?
Divya? Also, guys, please turn on your cameras. Why not? Um, Only the organizers are on. Just turn on your cameras, and you can also ask the question directly if you want.
Yeah, Divya, sorry to Divya Gautam.
Yeah.
I don't want to sort of make you speak if you don't want to, Divya, but um, I would, I mean, and my follow-up question, I guess, would be like stronger in what way? I think a lot of people interpret stronger as having larger penalties, right? And I don't think that that actually helps. Very frequently, that leads to a higher acquittal rate, because in the current environment, you have people being more sympathetic and using a higher burden of proof to the person who is attempting to be convicted in under that in that scenario. I don't think the rape laws need to be put is stronger in particular. I think what is hugely required is better investigation, um, speed. I think that's very important. Witness support and witness protection, feeling that so that whenever somebody makes a complaint, they feel that, oh, now I've come into this supportive environment and now I can relax because it's in the hands of the right people. I am not going to be demonized and put through the a ringer for a long time and going to have to essentially end up being an activist for myself and for others because I am in the criminal justice system. um, Rather that, okay, now I am being, something has happened to me and it was terrible, but now I am being taken care of by the state. That is the feeling that should come. There has to be financial support, psychological support, and speed, fast due process, and excellent investigation, um, and excellent legal aid.
Aman has raised his hand. I think, Aman, you can ask your question.
Unmute yourself, Amit.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask this is sort of a question in the historical context. So at one point of time we had an authoritarian government, and then there was judicial activism sort of began at that time, and then it was
Mm.
supported by public it was supported by public, and now again we have a sort of authoritarian government in certain sense, and then now the judiciary seems to be complicit with the government. So first of all, I would like to ask, like, what do you think are the reasons, what do you think is the reason like such a shift has happened? Is it just because of the elite nature of the institution, so that it is left to the whims of the judges? For example, at that point it was YV Chandrachud and people, and maybe we do not have as strong characters now. And this question also leads me to this part, that the inherent nature of judiciary as an organ of the government. So it, through judicial overreach, it tends to violate the separation of power, while the system of checks and balances doesn't exactly seem to apply to it practically, because the collegium system is an elite self-recruitment agency. So those are the two parts. I hope I didn't make it very complicated.
It's not complicated. Well, there's a whole bunch of things that you've said. One is that you've said that it's an elite structure. It's got to be an elite structure. because it's got to be people who have a sort of huge understanding of law, and it's got to be individuals, right? Can you make the appointment system a bit more robust and democratic? Yes. A lot of us were in favor of the NJAC, basically a different mechanism for judicial appointment, but not in the structure that was then proposed, which gave a veto to government, right? Um, the trouble, I mean, it's look, every system is going to be imperfect. And in that structure, you're going to have the necessity of judges having political links and to lobby politically, right? And to be popular politically, which is not something we particularly want either. But that seemed to be the the thing that the alternative that seemed most reasonable, instead of the collegium. I mean, you said that judicial activism began at the time of the emergency, which is not quite right. In fact, that was a particularly dark time because if you look at ADM Jabalpur, for example, ADM Jabalpur, there was a lot of bowing down to Indira Gandhi's, hegemonic suspension of rights, right? And in fact, Puttaswamy Justice D.Y. Chandrachud then and what they did in Puttaswamy was that they finally officially overruled ADM Jabalpur. So that was a very important move, you know, keeping in mind, therefore, that the great dissents are things that find their way into law in the far future sometimes. And so they are extremely important. Was there a question in there?
I mean, the question was that is it because of the very nature of the institute that, as in the captain of the ship, whoever is at the helm is the one who matters, and the entire institution after that doesn't
I
matter
think
as
there are
much.
particular processes that should be followed. Like, so for example, at the moment, the captain of the ship is the master of the roster and decides where the cases are to be allocated, etc. And I think that should be made a lot more predictable. That it can't just be that so much of the administrative power that leads to justice and injustice cannot reside in one individual. That's one thing. So you have to have predictability, more predictability and more transparency. In terms of elevation to the court, we've seen recent examples of some of them are very good judges, but I don't think that's the point. People being elevated out of turn, some very junior judges being elevated, where instead of a time at which they were either chief justices of a high court or acting chief justice of a high court, right? So I think that sort of thing gives rise to the apprehension of the Caesar's wife standard not being met. And I think that's something that's very significant. Ultimately, I think the process of rights realization has got to be circular. You've got to be able to have a situation where there's a problem, you have a catalyzing force so that citizens are then able to activate, whether it's the court, whether it's a democratic rising, and the institutions then react and reconstitute themselves um, in accordance. And where that breaks down, or where the perception of that breaks down, is when you have a problem.
Okay, we are out of time, guys. I'm so sorry I can't take any more questions because I've been told that we are running out of time. So I'd like to thank Karuna for giving us this talk and answering the questions. And thank you everyone for being here. And I will now hand it over to the host.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Meghna.
guys. Thanks. Bye.
Yep. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for listening throughout. Thanks for the few of you who turned your videos on, which is nice. Yeah, I'll also thank our speaker and our moderator. Great job, really interesting ideas, and especially one of the things that you talked about caste We're also having a keynote address on that just after
Okay.
this, and I'll drop the link in the chat for anybody who's
Who
interested.
is it?
There are 3 speakers in the keynote address. I'll tell you the names. The names are Divya Malhari, Beena Palikal, and Cynthia Stephen.
Okay.
And the keynote address takes place just after this. Let me just drop the link in the chat for a minute, and anybody who's interested, you can of course join that keynote address in 5 minutes probably now. Somebody's asking on the chat. I think we're out of time, so one last question is not possible. Yeah, but overall, thank you everybody. Thanks for a wonderful keynote address today.
Feel free to reach out on Twitter.
Excuse me, ma'am. Can I ask a small question?
I think they're out of time.
We are out of time.
So
We have
Eric,
another
just,
session
just
after
reach out on
this.
Twitter and I'll answer whatever I can there. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for having
Thanks.
me. Good luck.
Thank you.